I do work at Penn State's Sustainability Institute. I do work on academic programs. I curate a thing called the Field Guide to Teaching Sustainability. I gave you guys these little postcards of it, and I'll show you a little bit about that. I'll just tell you a little about the presentation today. I'm going to narrate a story, more or less, of teaching in a boys' boarding school and not having to, but choosing to do a large unit on climate change in an environmental science class. And what happened when I got an email from a conservative father who thought that I was indoctrinating my students into a, quote, cult of climate alarmism, end quote. This is something that teachers around the country face. It's not a huge number of people. It depends on where you live. But there are ways to craft an assignment that can be rich in civic development as well as deep scientific literacy. And so that was my goal. And so that's kind of what I'm going to build to. But first I'm going to do some shameless advertising. So the Field Guide to Teaching Sustainability, you have a card right now that with some information about that. Oh, look at that guy. We'll get to him. All right? So on the Field Guide, I have resources available right now so that you can teach, you can get into a lot of grade-appropriate, developmentally appropriate curriculum on climate change. A lot of it is science, as it says, engaging climate, mostly science, curricula. I have dozens and dozens and dozens of resources on this post alone that go from little kids up through college. Some of them, or one of them I should say, includes, there's Admiral David Titley in Richard's show, Earth the Operator's Manual. So I see Richard smiling, it makes him happy, all right? But it is an incredible resource. My first year teaching at Kiski, Earth the Operator's Manual was my textbook. It went over some of my students' heads, I must admit. Having come from teaching college to then teaching 11th and 12th graders, that was definitely a lesson for me. But the television show is excellent, and there are all kinds of educational materials connected to it that PBS and EarthTom have provided. So if you're interested in continuing to go on this route, I have compiled and curated materials for you. All right, now we'll get to him. Oh, not yet, sir. Okay, so I taught at Kiski, the Kiski Community Spring School. It was founded by Andrew Wilson, who is Woodrow Wilson's brother. Okay, it is over 100 years old. It has always been a boys' boarding school, and when I applied for this job, nearing the end of my PhD, I thought, wow, what's going on here? They were hiring for a director of sustainability at a boys' boarding school. Now, if you know anything about boys' boarding schools, you would not typically describe them as liberal places. Okay? Decidedly not. They are culturally pretty conservative places. They have taken boys, or gathered boys, and set them aside from the rest of the world in a cloistered environment so that they can learn to become men. Okay? And this may sound like a very outdated idea. You might think, what is going on? Sophia's making this face like, what? Right? But they had some members on their board who thought, you know, this sustainability stuff is really important. And an actor named David Conrad, some of you have probably seen him in some movies and television. He was on the board. he thought this is really important. A former board member of the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture, whose husband was faculty at Carnegie Mellon, they said, we really think that you guys need to be doing something about sustainability. They went, they got a grant, they devised a position, and they hired me. So, Peter Buckland, total sustainability nut advocate guy, PhD in education theory and policy, almost, I was finishing my dissertation, goes to this boys' boarding school where he is expected to, among other things, teach sustainability. Now, when I say sustainability, I'll just use a sort of standard definition, and it's approximately the Penn State definition. So it is the integration of human health and happiness, environmental quality, and economic well-being for current and future generations. Okay, so we have some aspect of human health and happiness, so society, economic well-being, so we have an economic component in there, and environmental quality. So these are the three pillars of sustainability: people, planet, profits. That's a good heuristic for it. And I teach more or less from that perspective. Now, going into a boys' boarding school in a very conservative part of the state as well, I thought, it's in Westmoreland County, it's northeast of Pittsburgh. I thought, I bet there's going to be something there. But they're asking me to do some things that, well, what's going to happen? So they had a lead building, the Leadership in Engineering and Environmental Design building, a dormitory that they wanted to create educational materials for. That was on me. I thought, okay, that's cool. I can teach people about sustainable yield forestry. That would be something I would be able to work on. Developing people's energy literacy. Talking about the problems of volatile organic compounds coming off of furniture and varnish. So indoor environments, clearly those come from chemical plants where the people living nearby then are the collateral damage of the development of those chemical products. Then they get put on furniture, sent to you, hundreds of them in a dorm. That changes the indoor air quality. That's a sustainability issue. So I got to develop all these sort of curricular tools that would be people reading signs, building a website that would do this. It was pretty fun working with my students to develop those materials. I also got to do super fun things like build and take care of an organic garden with my students. This is us building it right here. This is me building things. I got to play with power tools, powered by fossil fuels. Right there in the middle, but I got to work with the wood shop teacher, and I brought an arborist to the school one day, and we went up and down the beech tree in the middle of campus. It was awesome. His name is Jim Savage, by the way. He teaches at Penn State. I see a nodding head. It was so cool, and the kids, like the boys, right, they're like 16, and they're like, think they're like really awesome. And some of them were the most inept, goofy, awkward people trying to go up and down a tree on a line. It was awesome. We had so much fun. So I got to do these really fun things, and I was going to have to teach environmental science. Now, I knew that I was going to teach about climate change, and I was going to do an extensive unit on the science of the climate and the effects of climate change, and hopefully get to so what are we going to do about this stuff? Knowing where I was going, my hunch was that I was probably going to encounter a parent who thought that this was a bunch of crap. They would quote Jim Inhofe to me and say that climate change is the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on mankind. And I was right. Okay? Now, the reason I thought this, and many of you probably know some of this information, is Pew and other organizations have been doing polling for quite a while that shows that there is an enormous partisan political worldview identity divide in this country about whether or not global warming, climate change, whatever you want to call it, is real and caused by people. So this is some polling data from 2013 showing that the members of the Tea Party really, really don't believe in climate change. So this is global warming evidence solid? Democrats agree. Independents, less. Republicans, and that was in 2013, at 50%. So big differences. And whether or not humans are the main cause, there's a huge partisan divide. And I know, Richard knows, many of you know, that in the world of climate science, this is not at all a controversy. So the controversy has been more or less manufactured. There he is. Okay, now, coming to today, this partisan divide is very, 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 very clear. So on the left here we have Ted Cruz, who has been ringing this bell that climate change is pseudoscientific, that the climate always changes. There's this whole sort of string of things that he can say in about 30 words, and he says 6 wrong things in this, and you can read about it. It was recently called, I think they're called, these incredible laugh lines is how they've been portrayed by his critics. But I think I want to point to someone that Richard brought up earlier. That's David Titley on the right. He's an admiral. He's a professor of meteorology at Penn State. So rah-rah, go Penn State. He said, this is him on the right testifying in front of a subcommittee, a committee that Ted Cruz chairs, and Titley is telling him, look, what you're telling us right now is wrong. And he says, I'm just a simple sailor, but it's hard for me to see the pause in that chart. Ted Cruz has been repeating this often said statement that there's been no global warming for the last 16 to 18 years, and this is David Titley saying, well, this is just not true. And I'm using David Titley as an example of someone who you may not suspect holds a lot of authority, because understanding David Titley's ability and who he is as a way to communicate climate change was instrumental to how I crafted an assignment. Okay. And I want to note that today is a really interesting day to be doing this, because yesterday Science Magazine released a study that the lead author, the lead researcher on it, is Eric Plutzer, who's a political science professor at Penn State. And it was done in conjunction with members of folks at the National Center for Science Education, that there is a lot of confusion among teachers about what to teach and how to teach climate change. So congratulations on getting us here today, together, because it's really a very important time, and that one of the most important things, and what I'm going to focus on, is this idea right here. College and university instructors will need to help reaching teachers and teachers in training who bring diverse political and value commitments to the classroom, particularly in avoiding boomerang effects. And I'll talk some about like worldview backfire and things like that, and how we can get around that. Because with an issue like climate change that's so tied to an idea of how our economy has come to be and how good we are as a people, what climate change has been framed as doing is telling us that often, many of us, that we're bad people. that the way that we've come to do things, a fossil fuel economy, is bad. And if what you hear is, well, that's bad, and that makes me bad, but I believe I'm good, then your choice is between thinking that you're a bad person and changing, or maybe you go, well, I'm not really a bad person, but maybe I can change. Or you just go, you know what? And students will do it, you've done it, I've done it. I'm like, don't tell, I'm not going to tell you like when I've ever been bad, but really believe I'm good. But every one of us has that we are who we are, we mostly like who we are, we hang out with people who tell us that who we are is good and right. And so when you bring something in as colossal as climate change that tells us that we have to change maybe everything, you're just getting into a fight. And we know it because it's all around us. I mean, you listen to the presidential candidates right now, it's there. Okay, and it's in school. So here I am, I'm at Kiski, I have to think about what I'm going to do. I start teaching a class. So here's I cut the top off. Environmental Science Toward a Sustainable Future. So that's my textbook. If you end up teaching an environmental science class, I recommend it. It's quite good. I supplemented it with lots and lots and lots of things. You'll see a couple of them. But my goals were scientific literacy. I want people to understand what's science. In particular, what is environmental science and ecology, all right? I wanted them to master the concepts. In science, this is what you're supposed to do, right? You want them to be able to integrate their thinking so that they can see the relationships between different concepts, use them, and reason from them for their own work. Also, connected to this is sustainability literacy. As the director of sustainability, that's what I'm supposed to do. And I am myself also. I would want that to be a goal. So sustainability literacy doesn't just involve science. There's also an ethical component to it, which requires ethical reflection. Richard brought up the number of people using an amount of stuff at a given pace. The math ends up being pretty simple, that if we have too many people using too much stuff too fast, you end up in these dire apocalyptic scenarios. They're really very easy to go to. Well, that may be the case, so what are we going to do? That's an element of sustainability literacy for me. I'm going to go to place-based knowledge really quickly. I had my students do things that were very applied, so we made an arboretum, for example. I wanted them to know about their place, the plants and animals with which or with whom we were residing on campus. 350-acre campus, half of it was wooded. Making an arboretum, pretty easy. And they got to learn about all these different trees and things like that. But most importantly for me was ecological citizenship. I wanted them to understand that and try to work in ways, either through deliberation, common deliberation, or projects that would have some sort of outreach and then feedback to them, where they would learn about things in a way that would enable them to be better participants in a functioning democracy. And I'll say something very political right now, not like the garbage post-Citizens United, enormously corrupt political system that we have right now. Editorial. That's not something I would say in that class. I would not say that. Because my goal was for them, through learning and reflection, to get to a point where they could see themselves being good participants in a democracy where they would be collectively shaping their futures, hopefully in an intelligent, sustainable direction. So what are some of the things I would do? Well, I would send them to the Australian Bureau of Meteorology and say, okay, let's look at temperature records for a different country. Let's look at Australia. Okay, let's look at the trends. And look, we can play with all this data, and I love this site. I still kind of go to this site, and I'm like, wow, let's play with maps, and we can like play with Tasmania, or we can look at ocean surface temperatures, precipitation records, all kinds of things. So you can get into all sorts of fun geography with this. You can get into, obviously, temperature, different graphic representations, and so I would give them these assignments where they would have to run around through all these data sets and maps and play with them, but inevitably they would see you cannot escape the trend lines. So this gets at the difference between weather and climate, and so it's unavoidable for them to see data, that the data all points in the same direction. Another example. So we would look at the cumulative effect of the forcing of different greenhouse gases. And so here we have, oh, you can't see the dates here at the bottom, but over time, we can look at, so Richard had talked about radiative forcing, right? We're just talking about physics, right? And then the accumulation of different greenhouse gases in the atmosphere over time, right, are growing, and that we would be able to see, that we would predict based on this, that the climate was warming. So I had them do incredibly, just sort of, all right, we're going to be doing calculations. We're playing with data. But it needs to go somewhere. We talked about sea level, and I'm not going to get to that next slide quite yet. We get, sea level rise, the accumulated impacts, the things we can already see. There's a great video, Lines of Evidence, and it comes from the Met office in out of the UK. What are the different lines of evidence that we can see sea level rise, glaciers melting, etc., and how have they changed over time? This video is very short. I highly recommend it. I used it in my class, and they went, oh, and it was one of my introductions to impacts. But when you're in there, I'm in class with 14 boys. I would bet, well, 2 different classes of 12 boys, 14 boys. Half of their parents would doubt the reality of climate change in some way. So this happened. I get this email. Dear Mr. Buckland, my son, something, 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 we've been talking. I'm worried that I didn't put up the whole email because that wouldn't be fair to Mr. Last name. That you're bringing my son into a cult of climate change. Alarmism. This man is a geologist. And he has worked for the state, and he works for different companies doing all sorts of things. And I have done my own research. And I would like to come to your class to do a presentation on the other side. Now, how many of you have taught your own classes now? Okay. When someone if someone came to you and said, I think that you're making an error and I want to come to your class and sort of correct what you've done, how would you react?
Not particularly gracefully.
Yeah, probably not so well, huh? Right? Yeah. That like, hey, back the up, right? Immediate, right? So, this is how I felt. This is me playing in my old thrash metal band, Collapse. Okay. All right? All of our songs were about ecological devastation and things like that. I call it eco-thrash metal. Songs like The Universal Wolf and things like that, right? Okay, so there we are, playing. That's how I felt. I wanted to just barrage Mr. Last Name with this torrent of Not necessarily get out of my face, but essentially saying get out of my face because this is how I do things. Now, I write really fast. And I crafted a probably somewhere between 800 and 1,200 word rebuttal, right, to this guy. And I was like sitting there, you know, it's like I'm writing for like an hour and a half, like, you know, and I'm like International Energy Agency and NOAA and all, you know, this is what I do, and Richard Alley and Michael Mann, and, you know, just like, I just want to like clobber this guy with everything in the kitchen sink. And then I went, okay, I'm going to save that, and I like went to lunch. And then I went, oh, you know, I'm glad I didn't hit send. Because if I would have hit send, this guy's going to be like, wow, you're a jerk, and I don't want you teaching my kid. So I had a choice. So over here I have my buddies who went on to the U.S. Naval Academy. They were my students the first year I was there. Andre, Zach, and Josh. And we ran the Greenwood Furnace Trail Challenge together. It's a half marathon. It has about 4,000 feet of elevation gain in it. We trained for that all spring and went and the four of us ran it together. That's something you can do at a boys' boarding school. You can like decide, hey, I'm gonna like kill myself with guys who are half of my age, who are like, whoa, you're old, and old, right? You're old, and you were like beating the hell out of us. That's great, right? So I had some liberty there. I had some freedom, but I wanted to be more like this guy right here than this guy over here. Because if I'm this guy, I'm going to turn, right, I love thrash metal, I love Slayer, right, I mean, you know, you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with you? You know, I've seen Carcass, you're like, what? Okay, big fan. I also took some of my students to do that too. That might have been more awesome, but anyway. Most of you probably think that music sucks, it turns me off, and I just get pissed when I hear it, I want it to go away. Okay, I respect that. I don't want a parent to feel that way about me as a teacher. I want that parent to believe that what I'm trying to do is cultivate the skill, ability, and goodness of his children. So I took that email, I deleted it, and I started over again. And wrote back to him and said, thank you, Mr. Last Name. I really appreciate that you have taken the time to talk to your son about what he's doing in school. I'll tell you a little bit about what I do in class. And I kept it very short, which is just to say, we follow the science. This is what the science says. Lastly, I said, I am not the arbiter of your son's or any of my students' values. They learn them from many people, and I am going to give them the opportunity to reflect on what they have learned in a way that lets them uncover what they value. Thank you for offering to come to my class. I'm not going to take you up on it, but I do appreciate your curiosity or something like that. You know, rah rah, best, cheers, something like that. I like saying to today at the end of my emails. Peter Buckland. So this guy was doubtful of climate change. I didn't tell you one of the things that he had said. He said, in my research, well, I don't deny that climate change is caused in part by quote-unquote anthropologic things. He meant anthropogenic, but anthropologic. All right? But blah, 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 something about nature, right? Really, it's nature doing it. So he's in this doubter camp, and this is something, the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication, Global Warming 6 Americas. It's a really fantastic study that has been done, and it's happened a few times. I suggest the Yale Project on Climate Change Communication as a resource to understand what we're, in some way, what we walk around here thinking when you hear the term climate change. Because what I hear and what Ted Cruz hears are totally different. I hear, man, this is a really complicated, really fascinating thing that we need to do something about, and I need to learn more about. Ted Cruz hears, this is a massive left-wing conspiracy to take over the United States. And my students are somewhere in there, between me and Ted Cruz, right? So how are we going to deal with this? Well, I had to understand that they and me and the father all engage in something called motivated reasoning. So there is a reason that I have a picture of Michael Jordan over here. Motivated reasoning is the unconscious tendency of individuals to process information in a manner that suits some end or goal extrinsic, outside of the formation of accurate beliefs. If I walk around in the world and I think global free trade agreements built on a fossil fuel economy are great, I believe that that makes me free. Climate change is a massive threat to who I am, and I'm going to try to figure out a way that it's wrong. Because the thing I believe in is me. And my group who tells me that I'm right about that. And so climate change must be wrong because freedom. And I don't mean that in any sort of thin way. I mean, there's this thing now that where we say because freedom or because eggs or something like that. But that's, in essence, that's the little nutshell version of it. And all of us walk around doing it. And sometimes it's not really a problem. Well, if you have millions or tens of millions of people doing that, that might be a real problem, and that makes it an educational problem. Okay, the reason I have a picture of Michael Jordan here is this was his last game as a Chicago Bull. In the championship game, Michael Jordan was, the game was super close. Michael Jordan, dribbling, he goes, he's just about to take a shot. Brian Russell was right in front of him, and he puts his hand on Brian Russell's butt, and it looks like maybe he pushed him. And then he goes for this beautiful fadeaway jumper, hits it, wins the game. Did Michael Jordan foul Brian Russell? The thing that determines or likely is that positively correlates with your answer to that question is which team you were a fan of. If you're a Jazz fan, oh my God, Michael Jordan fouled him, and people go crazy and the whole championship is garbage. But if you're a Michael Jordan fan or a Chicago Bulls fan, you're like, dude, that was finesse. That was awesome. That's like the greatest play I've ever seen. And it's like, what? Okay, these people don't live in the same universe. And we do the same thing about climate change. You've probably seen, if you're a Penn State football fan, you're like, oh my God, he was totally not out of bounds. Like, well, maybe he's out of bounds, right? We do it in everything. So we get these tribal identities. And so when we look at evidence, our reasoning process, we look like lawyers. We believe in something, and so we argue for it, and we look for evidence that says, yes, Peter, you are right. Right? But we're not acting like scientists or judges. We do not carefully, dispassionately look at evidence because it goes into an emotional filter that says, is this who I am or is this not who I am? Not, is it correct? That's That's an educational problem, right? So we engage in something called identity protective cognition. We're like, well, that guy, even though he has, or woman, whoever, they have lots of credibility, but there's something that's wrong about them. I don't believe it because some reason that's not who I am. We think, oh, I'm totally realistic. Those people just aren't realistic. Be realistic, come on. I see the world as it really is. Those people don't. You've probably thought this before. I have. It's like, well, uh-oh, we're all walking around doing it. Uh-oh. Objectivity. You know what? You're not being objective. You. No, you need to be objective. You know what happens when I tell someone that? We become less objective. She's like, no, you're not being objective. And I'm like, no, you. And then it turns into this stupid thing where we have a feedback loop about objectivity when we're both becoming more subjective. You can see it in the political discourse right now. It's fascinating, right? We do it because we're protecting who we are. And so we start to do all of these things to conform our beliefs to the group that we believe is right. And we are part of that group, so it must be right. I'm oversimplifying a little bit. So I get back to this. So how am I going to do something? Well, I need to do something with his son and my students. And I need to avoid something called a worldview backfire effect. I need to make it possible for his son and the other sons in that classroom to not feel threatened. But I also have to deal with a scientific reality. This becomes very challenging with climate change. It's possible that through a deliberative exercise constructed to get rid of a lot of that identity badge stomping, that they could learn something that would be scientifically elevating and inform their ability as citizenship. So this is what I did. I crafted an assignment around the intelligence squared debate format. And I'll explain a little bit about what that is. And I called it Climate Resolved. Climate change is not a crisis. Resolved. Climate change is not a crisis. So these are the rules. This is from the Intelligence Squared website. It's pretty simple. Get teams, well, what Intelligence Squared does is they get teams of 3 for a proposition and against a proposition. So they have debated many, like dozens and dozens and dozens of these. You can stream them online. I've used them I taught English 202. I know many of you are like, oh God, that class. No. Mine, I like to believe, of course, because it's me and I'm right and I'm a good person. Is that motivated reasoning? Right? I used them in class and I've used this in a couple of different formats. But they've done things like, America is too damn religious. Whoa. The freedom of speech must include the right to offend. So they get into these contentious things that can elicit a lot of learning. So I thought, all right, I'm going to take these, okay, and 3 against 3, and they'll each have a different way of arguing. And then they get question and answer with one another or from the audience. And then whoever moves the audience the most wins. Okay, so it's interactive. It's thought you definitely have to understand a position and try to be persuasive. But I could put rules on it because I'm a teacher. So, why? So, this is how I framed the assignment. So, I didn't get into this garbage about if climate change is real, yes or no, which is, according to a lot of the studies that have been done, that's what ends up happening. Because teachers think, I need to get into this somehow, and there's this political argument, and Yes or no, real or not, caused by people or not caused by people. And as someone who, I'm not Richard Alley, I'm not on the IPCC, I'm not the Evan Pugh Professor of Glaciology, but I follow the science very, very closely. If you followed my Twitter feed, you'd be like, oh my God, do you do anything else? Right? I do, but it is something that is very important to me to stay on top of the science and the political environment. So yes or no is not an option to me. But what I was able to do is address the issue that the parent had raised, alarmism. By framing it as not a crisis, it's gone. I'm not saying it is a crisis. We're going to debate whether it is or not. And not is the primary frame. Then I could put students into equal numbers of groups, and I could say, students, I know that there are a few students in here who really think that climate change is a calamity. And I'm going to make them argue the opposite. I'm going to put them on the other team. I had a German student. He was very educated in issues of climate and human rights. It was pretty incredible. I made him argue the other side. Yeah. The student or the child of the parent, I put him on it is a crisis side. To see, you just sort of have to see what's going to happen. So they would work in these groups, right? It was great. I also said, I brought up the objective thing. I never instructed them, you have to be objective or rational or unbiased or something like that. No. You need to go and find great evidence for your argument. So I divide them into groups of 3, gave them instructions, pointed to the kinds of sources they could use. So you can't use Breitbart.com. Sorry, not allowed. I also pointed them away from Tree Hugger. I like Tree Hugger because Tree Hugger tells me that who I am as a person is good. But you can end up in some you have people on there who are not scientists at all, nor are they policy experts. They're just, sharp, really good writers. Right? Some of the stuff on there is like funny and quirky. You're like, oh yeah, I'm awesome. Right? No. I wanted to stay away from that because I wanted people to have reason to trust an authority. They still could use things like the Union for Concerned Scientists if they wanted to. There is plenty of good fossil fuel data through the Energy Information Agency. There's a ton of stuff that I pointed them to, but it was kinds, all right, of sources. They had to develop a thesis, so just like you guys did, English 15, right? Spend a week guiding them through the process of formulating the argument, helping them, facilitating them, and then they had to appoint a champion for their group who would be that person would argue, because we didn't have the ability to do it takes 2 hours to do an intelligence squared debate, and they're all doing sports and all sorts of things. So I had to work with my time constraints also, as you as teachers will have to do or have already done. Debate. Whoever in the class wins that person had the best presentation and best answers to question and answer, they get an extra 10 points. That's how I did it. Now, of course, that favors students who are already very good. So there's an issue of, was I rewarding the right person? Okay, so you're going to have to think about these things too as you go on. But they voted, and they voted blind. Okay, they turned in a ballot. So how did they argue this? It's either not a crisis or it is a crisis. And they were, I was helping them. I'm obviously, or I think it's obvious to myself, it may not be as obvious to you, but that I know a lot of the debates around this, so I could kind of point them in a direction. So what did some of them do? One group said, you know what, it's not a crisis because on the scale of crises, there are worse crises. There are only so many things we can attend to in the world, and so global poverty and the AIDS pandemic, pretty bad, going on for a long time. Lots of people die. They also, malaria was part of their argument. Now, I can say, Peter, well, you know, climate change makes poverty issues worse. And with things like malaria and other infectious diseases, worse. They're in 11th and 12th grade. They are not honor students. I can get them so far. But on the scale of problems, this is not, climate change is not a crisis. Munich Re and Swiss Re, what is that about? The global reinsurance, so the insurers of insurers, they are incredibly worried about climate change. So they're like, wait, you have insurance agencies that have to cover risk. Climate change introduces a huge amount of risk, right? Well, I mean, rising sea levels. Oh, wow, that's a lot of coastal infrastructure that could be doomed. And when something like Sandy hits, that's an issue. And I'll give you an example that's terrifying to insurance and reinsurance. In Florida, right now, they don't have the best, I'll say the most resilient state insurance policy, despite being more susceptible to sea level rise than just about any state in the nation. There is a paper that came out in 2015, Carrie Emanuel from MIT is the lead author, and it is on the possibility of what is called a gray swan cyclone. A gray swan event is an event that is statistically low in probability, but over time is likely to happen. So a gray swan tropical cyclone is a category 5+ hurricane or typhoon that hits an area of value, and causes an enormous amount of damage. So imagine Hurricane Katrina going into Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is a funnel. If you get a hurricane with sustained wind speeds of 150 or more miles an hour going in there, you could have a storm surge of 21 feet. Tampa Bay, just like annihilated. That exact event happening, statistically improbable. But as we warm ocean and atmospheric temperatures and cyclones become more intense, the possibility of that happening goes up and up and up and up and up. Risk assessors go, oh crap, we have to deal with that. And then the people, our insurance companies go, wow, I have to deal with that. And then the insurers of the insurers go, they're everywhere. So I had 2 students who went, you know what, that's it. That makes it a crisis, because it's going to cost us huge amounts of money. And I was like, wow, that's pretty good. All I did was say, go look at Swiss Re and Munich Re, and they went to town. They're very, very gifted students, I have to say. Some said, you know what, renewable energy, it's just going to take over. It's just going to happen, and it's going to happen fast enough that this will not be a crisis. And they said, well, look at these trends, and they quoted Ray Kurzweil, who's this like technological optimist guy, and they were very excited. I was like, huh, all right, that's cool. Some of them talked about, well, there's already a severe disruption of the carbon cycle, so you science nerds, right? You can get into this. You go, So they really looked at like land use, and it was really cool. We have a severe disruption of the carbon cycle, and because of positive feedback loops, they could become even worse. Dun, 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 doom versus hope, right? And others, of course, didn't follow directions and totally screwed it up, and I had to be upset with them, and they were like, Mr. Buckland, you didn't do the assignment, you jackass. I might have said that, but So it's not like everyone was awesome. I had 4 groups who were really, really great, and some who were like okay, and a couple that were really bad. Sounds like a classroom, right? So how did it go? Well, Matt is not his real name, but Matt and Nate had this exchange. Nate is the son's father, and he argued very, very well. He also wants to be a lawyer. And he was their champion. So Matt said, getting very frustrated with being peppered with these really good questions from Nate, said, well, do you think it's a crisis? And he said, no, but that's not the point. I'm arguing a position and doing it the best I can, but there are facts and we shouldn't be afraid of facts. I don't have to think this is a crisis to believe it's real. That is markedly different in rhetoric from what his father had said. And so I look at that and I say, hey, that as an outcome in a class, that's pretty great. If the son of the climate change doubter guy has a, I think, reasonable reaction to that, to say, well, I don't think it's a crisis, but that doesn't mean it's not real. That was different from what had probably been before. We followed this up by taking the Yale 6 Americas survey, and you can do it too. So in the wake of doing this, this assignment, we then had a sort of debrief in class where they got to actually they've taken a position and had to argue it, but then who are they? What do they think? With no fear of some kind of retribution from an authority. We just got to have a conversation about it. And I got to say, so I take the study, and, unsurprisingly, I'm up here. I'm in the alarmed group, right? And I had several concerned. Most of my students were in concerned and cautious, but I still had disengaged and doubtful. I had no dismissives left, if I did in the first place. But most of my students at the end, and I didn't make them do it at the beginning, so I can't do a longitudinal comparison, right? They were in there. And I did, of course, have some alarmed. Alvin, who's now at NYU studying environmental science. Okay. So, we got to have this conversation, and they said, Mr. Buckland, why are you so alarmed? And that was their question. They wanted to know. Of course they do. You have teachers and you're like, really? What do they really think? Your students want to know who you are. So we got to have that conversation. It was great. I think that this was one of the best assignments that I've ever gotten to put together and work through. So these are the kinds of questions that I still have. Can we do this with adults in public forums? That would be great. What are the appropriate roles, especially in the science class, of having a political and moral debate? I know science teachers who would be like, whoa, I'm holding the door shut, stay back. We don't talk about that stuff in my class. Students tend to really love it, but you do have to control it so that a student doesn't take over, right? I'm one of those students who will take over a class, I know, so you have to guard for people like me. So, given recent understanding, should science teachers follow the lead of an increasing number of climate scientists and speak up about climate risk? You'll notice that Richard today, he did not equivocate the risks at all. Mike Mann does not equivocate the risks. David Titley, not equivocating risks. Catherine Hayhoe at Texas A&M, not equivocating risks. Jim Hansen getting himself arrested for this. So this is an interesting question. As a science teacher, usually, but a social studies teacher, I've incorporated climate change, by the way, into English class. I taught the book Dune, which is basically about terraforming a planet, doing deliberate climate change. So, you know, what are the roles that we have? And as a teacher to be or a current teacher, these are really important questions to ask. I clearly have a pretty powerful position. I'm not the arbiter of your values either. These are things that I think that you're going to need to wrestle with and that you'll have to do with the community, with your fellow teachers, with your administrators. You have state standards put on top of you. You have parents. So that's really the end. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to stick around and answer them. Yeah. Thank you.